I'm Jack Oswald, and you're listening.
This is Nathan Hamel, and you're listening to...
I'm Richard C. Hoagland, and you're listening to...
I'm Art Bell, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
All right, greetings and welcome back to another episode of Dr. J Radio Live, broadcasting from the City of Angels. Well, not so angelic city, especially not these days, where it is a little after 7 p.m. Pacific time. As you know, this is truly an international show. Right off the bat, we do have my co-host live in London, where it is 3 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, and of course, our guest tonight, who happens to be on the East Coast in Massachusetts, right in the same state as our good friend Michael Dukakis. But of course, we're going to be speaking on a very different topic tonight. Tonight, we are speaking on crop circles, a very important topic. I know we've touched on it in the past, but never as much as we're going to go into in depth tonight. Why? Because tonight we have the preeminent crop circle researcher in the entire world. And I'm very happy to introduce Miss Nancy Talbot. Nancy, welcome to the show.
Well, that's quite an introduction. Hi, how are you?
I'm doing great. So let's give some background on you before we give, of course, the background or before we get into some of these topics. So tell people how long you've been involved in this. Tell people about BLT, you being the president of that, and how BLT is nowhere near as famous as Nancy Talbot is now.
Well, it started with John Burke, a businessman in New York City interested in electrical phenomena, EM stuff, who had discovered right about the same time I did, which is 89, the crop circle phenomenon in England. And of course, William Levengood, the biophysicist in Michigan, who did all of the early plant and soil work, and me. And we came together in 89, 90. And Levengood had already started to work on the plants and soils. His field was, biophysics, so that's what he wanted to look at, and had already started to find some abnormalities, changes in the crop circle plants, which were not in the controls. But he needed help to do any sort of real volume. And John took over all of the library research work, because an awful lot of that has to be done. And I took over the organization of field teams, training them, developing a protocol for sampling so that the protocol was followed, generally the same protocol every time, regardless of who was doing the sampling. And over the years, we worked together for almost 10 years doing that sort of work, examining crop circle plants and soils in, I can't remember how many countries, 7, 10. We ended up with something like 17 different countries that we'd examined the plants and soils and kept finding these very consistent physical changes in the plants and ultimately then in the soils, which were consistent regardless of the country, indicating, of course, that these changes were related to whatever energy it was that was causing the actual crop circles.
There's another gentleman whose name eludes me right now who was in the UK. He now lives in the East Coast of the United States, who's been studying crop circles for quite a long time. Maybe you can refresh my memory?
There are a number of people. It started in England with Pat Delgado, who was, I think he may have been the first. He and Busty Taylor and Colin Andrews and George Wingfield.
Yes.
Were all a group of people who were starting to document them. And it was because of the books they wrote that a lot of the rest of the people in the world even knew that it was happening. I mean, it's how we first discovered it. And at that time, of course, we only knew that circles were occurring in the UK. Later, once we got involved and a number of other people, it became clear that they were occurring really all over the world, as best we could tell, and in a huge variety of crops, not just in the wheat and oats and barley, which were originally what was being found in the UK.
And this, by all means, is, as you mentioned, a global phenomenon, just like UFOs. And I'm glad you brought up Colin Andrews, because when he was on the show about a year and a half ago, unfortunately, he's been sick with his wife Sylvia. He wrote a book, and that's the most recent book, and that's the reason why he came on the show, to promote it. But he made a revelation that he had never in his entire life stated, because he didn't want the world, especially the mainstream ridicule world, to debunk what he was really researching. The fact was that he revealed in 2015 was that he himself had been taken. He was an abductee from age 5, going back to the 50s, and that blew my mind.
I don't know about that, but I would like to really focus, if it's okay with you, on the more spiritual, the aspect of consciousness that seems to me to be the most critical thing to pay attention to in the circle phenomenon, the nature of consciousness itself, what we, all the aspects of it that we none of us currently understand, and how interrelated the circle phenomenon, the UFO situation, out-of-body experiences, remote viewing, poltergeist activity, all of these things that we label individually and separately, because that's all we know at this point. The evidence seems to me to be growing. A lot of this gained through the work with Robert Vandenbroek in Holland, that it is, in fact, these are all bits and pieces of the same unknown thing. They're all related.
I'm glad you mentioned the main word, consciousness, because this was a topic that 20, 30, 40 years ago wasn't really touched upon, except for Edgar Mitchell with his Noetic Sciences organization. But now almost everybody's talking about this, because I think it is the one piece of the puzzle that truly links every part of this phenomenon. Wouldn't you agree?
I think that as we learn more about the nature of consciousness, what it really is, that what we're going to discover is that it is a much more, it's a much broader situation than we ever guessed. And in fact, it's all through consciousness, through the ultimate higher consciousness. We're all connected. And
exactly.
That's critical.
Universal consciousness, as some people call it, Akashic Records. But the point is we are all connected with one, not just with each other, with others, the visitors, and with actual phenomena such as crop circles, or, like you said, poltergeists and other anomalies. That is the one factor that is going through all of them. Now, I'm going to give you a name. It's actually a last name, and it's very famous in the United States and actually globally. And in the history of the world, this one of the relatives of this family was by far the richest person ever, if you account for inflation.
You're talking about Rockefeller now.
Exactly. John D. Rockefeller was worth an estimated $400 billion, which would have been today's money. But, that was a century ago. But Lawrence Rockefeller, I think it's Lawrence D. Rockefeller.
Lawrence is Laurance, by the way.
Yeah.
And Lawrence was, I don't know all the Rockefellers, so I can't say what they're all like, but I do know a little bit about him, having met him several times. And it appears to me from my conversations with him and many things he told me privately, that his primary interest in all of this stuff was exactly the same. He was aware of this larger consciousness. He was interested in the spiritual aspect of that consciousness, and clearly felt that the circle phenomenon, as well as perhaps many others, I don't know because I didn't talk about those things with him, but that the circle phenomenon was one expression of this larger consciousness.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because he recognized that, and finally most people are starting to recognize That is the one factor in all of it, and that is above us all. Even Edgar Mitchell recognized this on his way back from the moon when he had a revelation seeing the moon, the sun, and the planet in the same field of vision, Earth, the planet Earth. Now, let's talk about your relationship with Lawrence Rockefeller and what he funded and what sort of research he did with crop circles in you.
Well, in our case, he'd heard about the scientific. We published 3 papers in the peer-reviewed literature with presenting the early work that BLT did, the plant and soil abnormalities. And there are these 3 papers published during the 90s in peer-reviewed scientific journals. He had heard about I guess it was the first paper he'd heard about, and he asked me to come to New York to bring him up to speed on it all. And he offered to, after he heard some of the details, he offered to fund personally. This is not the Rockefeller Foundation. This is Lawrence personally, to fund another study, another one of the studies. And he asked me to write up a bunch of proposals of various things that I thought needed to be done. My money had paid for most of the work that was done up to that point, and I was running out. And he wanted to see what he could do to help. And so I proposed one thing in particular. We had already, from Levengood's work, realized that there's an energy system. This isn't one energy, it's a multiplicity of energies that were involved in creating the circles. This is based on the evidence in the plants and the soils. And they indicated that heat of some kind was one of the energies involved. We assumed that it was most likely microwave radiation because of the types of changes we were finding in the plants, which indicated they'd been exposed, among other things, to microwave radiation. So, if that were so, a friend of mine who was a clay mineralogist had been to a circle in Utah in 1996. She was a clay mineralogist, and she knew that some specific clays, which are found in soils, all over the world, are sensitive to heat. And so the idea was that if, in fact, the plants were showing obvious changes that could be related to exposure to heat, that maybe these clays, these very specific clays, would also show changes consistent with being exposed to heat. So that was the study he eventually decided to fund, and it was called the X-ray diffraction study of clay minerals in a crop circle soil. And we did the work. It involves sampling both the plants and the soils. Levengood did the plant work, as he always did, but I was in charge of that study, and I hired all the other scientists who were involved, and there were 4 others, were hired by me precisely because they had expertise in particular parts of the study, things that had to be done. The X-ray diffraction expert, for instance, was a material scientist and ran the X-ray diffraction machine. Then I had to have statisticians to actually look at the results of that work. And then finally, there was Dr. Robert Reynolds at Dartmouth, who was the preeminent clay mineralogist in the world at that point, head of the Mineralogical Society of America. He'd been the head of the Department of Earth Sciences at Dartmouth for years, and he was the guy who then did the interpretation of the study. The end result was that we found massive, massive alterations in the plants of exactly the same kind that Levengood had been documenting for years. But we also found this increase in the crystalline structure of these specific clays. And furthermore, the changes in the clays were found at precisely the same sampling points in the circles as were the plant changes. In other words, everywhere that we found the plant changes, we also found the change in the clay minerals. And we're talking here about surface soil. This is not deep soil. This is the top inch or so of surface soil. Now, the problem with this is that the change in crystalline structure had never been seen in surface soil before, ever. It was thought at that point to only occur in sedimentary rock. It's caused by the pressure, literally the pressure of mountains pressing down on sediments over hundreds or thousands of years. That's how this change, we're talking about the atomic structure in which this crystalline change occurs. So when Dr. Reynolds got all of our work, I couldn't believe that he was actually willing to do this, but he did. His first reaction was, no, this couldn't possibly be accurate work. And so he asked to see all of the mounts, the X-ray diffraction mounts, from the guy I had found in California. It's important to know that the X-ray diffraction guy, Dr. Sam Iyengar, had never even heard of crop circles. So there's no possibility here of experimenter bias. He didn't even know what a crop circle was. So I asked him to send the mounts to Dartmouth, which he did. Dr. Reynolds, by the way, had never heard of crop circles, didn't have the faintest idea what they were. Neither did the statisticians who did the statistical work. But Dr. Reynolds got the mounts. He redid the work on the Dartmouth XRD machine and got exactly the same results we had gotten. So then he thought, well, perhaps the statisticians had not done the work properly. So he redid all the statistics, and he came up with exactly the same, answer that we had come up with. He then asked us to run a few other kinds of tests on the samples, which we don't have to go into here because they're very complex. But he was trying to rule out, to see if there was some other explanation for this increase in the crystalline structure. We did all the work he asked. None of it turned out to provide the answer. So the ultimate interpretation by Dr. Reynolds was that we did, in fact, have a statistically significant, this is at the 99 or 95% level of confidence, in the change in the clay minerals. There was this increased crystallization. It did occur at the same locations as the plant changes at the 99% level of confidence, which you never get in science. And that led him to then say, and this is exactly what he said to me, we must be dealing here with an energy unknown to science. That entire report and his comments and all of the work is posted on the BLT website, but there was something he didn't know, and neither did I, nor did any of the rest of us involved in this particular study, but it's very pertinent. And that is that when we had finished the work, and I had written a full report for Mr. Rockefeller and sent it off to him, it was already in his hands, the field workers called me to tell me that they had discovered that there were at least 6, we interviewed at least 6 of these people, who were eyewitnesses to UFOs playing tag. Those are the exact words they used. UFOs playing tag over the study field just days before that particular crop circle was found by the farmer.
I have a few things I want to ask you about that, but we have a question from Dan Hoquist.
Let me finish just one thing here.
Sure.
Just so I can complete this. I did tell Reynolds about that. He died not too long after this study, but I was able to tell him that fact when we discovered it. And what's so important about this is we don't know that UFOs, not being sure exactly what they are, number one, not being actually positive that they made that crop circle. But when you put together the world's preeminent clay mineralogists in the world saying that we've got to be dealing with an energy unknown to science, and then you find out that you've got these eyewitnesses who were all, by the way, on a program that Unsolved Mysteries did about this, that, they saw these UFOs over that field, the likelihood seems to me to be fairly strong that in that case, not necessarily all crop circles, not even all genuine crop circles, but in that case, it appears quite likely that UFOs were involved directly in creating that formation.
Like I said, I have a couple things I want to ask, but before we do that, we got SoCal Dan, who also goes by on Twitter at Dan or Dan Donnell.
Don Dannell.
Don Dannell. Dan the man. SoCal Dan.
Hi, Nancy. Videos that I've seen are really interesting. The ones that have been caught of crop circles being made. And they look like the same plasma balls that were forming and evident as Foo Fighters during World War II.
And people have pointed that out to me. And in fact, Levengood's theory, the published hypothesis as for the causation of crop circles, is in fact that they are the result of an unknown, as yet unknown form of plasma discharge. And in fact, one of the other things I've got to get to is that I really want people to know about this, and it's this Facebook closing. On August 10th, Robert in Holland videotaped for the very first time in daylight a light ball making a small crop circle. I had just posted that on my Facebook page on the 12th of August. Later that day, I think it might have been August 13th actually, by the time I got it up, I posted another very critical piece of information. And it was that Lawrence Rockefeller had made copies of the X-ray diffraction report, the one we've just been talking about. He had made a full copy of that report. Along with a copy, he asked me to write about Robert, because he knew by then that I was working with Robert Vandenbroek. And so I wrote another full report and sent that to Lawrence also. Both of those were copied and then sent to this Dr. John Gibbons, who at the time was working, he was an advisor to the State Department, but he was the original director of the White House Office of Science and Technology and an assistant to President Bill Clinton regarding science and technology. When I posted that report with an image of Robert right next to one of the crop circles in Holland, and then I took a screenshot of the Office of Science and Technology, the heading on their website. When I posted that image, right after posting the information that Robert had just gotten this daytime video, which is very clear, of a light bulb making a crop circle, my Facebook was closed down within 2 hours. Bam.
Censorship. Unfortunately, censorship, which is another major thing we're going to talk about. But let's go across the Atlantic pond for a couple of questions real quick. Johnny Webb.
Good evening, Nancy. Johnny in London. Yesterday, I met documentary filmmaker Miles Johnson, and he suggested that some crop circles are still man-made, even though the time
I think most of them in England are.
Yes, but he suggests that even though the time to make them seems impossible with the time frames we currently understand, he suggests that there's a scalar weapon or device that's able to splice time-space and connect different dimensional time spaces, so bringing what we have in like a recent crop circle.
Well, so remember that some of what you hear about how long it takes to make some of these, there is absolutely nothing to back that up. We know, for instance, that one of the very intricate crop circles that has recently occurred in England took 3 days in broad daylight. It's in a place where the people who fly regularly, to check, they never go in this place. This has been true of many of the very complex, not all. I am not by any means saying that all of the complex circles are man-made, but the evidence strongly leans toward the idea that the majority of them are physically, and I'm talking mechanically flattened, not by lasers, not by some fancy technical gizmo, but literally physically with these boards, which is what the plank, the hoaxers show you all the time. And they're very clear marks on the plants. If we were allowed to examine them, if samples were taken and we were allowed to really look at them, that we could clearly show.
And
simply our physical evidence of mechanical flattening.
Mm-hmm. Let's also not forget what Colin Andrews, he wrote an entire chapter in his last book about crop circle makers, that a lot of them are making these crop circles not to hoax people, to pull a fast one or pull their leg, but because something is driving them, something in their consciousness, something in their subconscious.
I don't buy. I mean, I don't know. I don't know these people, but That's really not what's of interest. What's of interest is the real phenomenon. What is behind the real phenomenon? Why humans would go out and do whatever they do is that's more in the social studies field or something. I'm interested in what's creating the genuine phenomenon and its relationship to our consciousnesses and this larger, unified, cosmic, Akashic field type consciousness, because although when I started this, I absolutely thought we were going to find a fairly direct physical causation, over the years, and this has a lot to do with my work with Robert, I saw things which absolutely indicate the presence of how would you say it, an enlarged, a heightened, a broader consciousness, one that is able, in his case, he functions as a medium through which these consciousnesses then manifest, not just the crop circles, which occur around him, and they do all the time, but also this huge range of other strange things. To me, focusing on the genuine phenomenon, I have absolutely no interest in the people that make them for whatever reason they make them for. I think what's important is the genuine phenomenon and the proof that exists that there is a genuine phenomenon and it is not mechanical flattening. And also, just for those of you who think that it's the military or some, bunch of crazy military people with nothing else to do, you've got to remember that the phenomenon has existed as far back as the 1500s. And we also know absolutely for certain that the phenomenon existed, complex circles, in the early 1900s, long before we had any of the current, technology.
Well, Catherine in Argyll in Scotland on Facebook, she's asking, is Nancy keeping up with the current crop circles, and what do you make of the recent crop circle in Anstey near Salisbury, Wiltshire, which was reported on the 12th of August and covered by Jaime Maussan?
I think it's as man-made as they come, and if, again, we were allowed, you see, we're not allowed to do the sampling. If we were allowed to do the sampling and do it all properly, I think we could 100% prove to you that, in fact, that's man-made. That's one of the ones that was done during daytime over 3 days, and a well-trained, if in fact, and I am sure of this now, I wasn't to begin with, if there is a disinformation campaign going on about the crop circles, as we already know there is about UFOs and many other things, then wouldn't you expect that whoever that is that finds it so important to not inform the public honestly about the circle phenomenon, that they would be well funded, they could train people, they could pay them. I mean, when you think about this, the hoaxing thing, who for 30 years goes about this sort of nonsense for the heck of it?
And it sure
it's
is
ridiculous.
Wasn't that Doug and Dan or Dave and Dan or whatever.
But
it's
again,
ridiculous.
Nancy, with your 20 years experience on time, what is it as a seriologist? What makes you say this is a real crop circle and this is a man-made circle? What do
if
you
you will
use
go
as-
to the BLT website, you will see enormous amounts of detail telling you every single physical change that we have found and how the original work all indicated changes related to a discharging plasma. We're talking about microwave radiation because when plasma spiral, as they do around the Earth's magnetic field lines, as they're reaching closer and closer to the Earth, they emit microwaves. They also have very strong magnetic fields and very unusual electrical discharges. The evidence of all of those energies is found in the plants and soils, and I've listed them all with all the backup and the photos to show you. We get elongated apical nodes. We get expulsion cavities, holes blown out at the lower stem nodes. We get germination abnormalities. You take the seeds from the crop circle plants, and you also take the seeds from the controls, and then you germinate them. Guess what we found? When the crop circles occur in young crop, before the seed is fully formed, those plants are basically sterilized. The seeds will not develop. They do not produce viable seedlings if you were to plant them the following year. However, when the crop circles occur late in the season, the genuine ones, when the seed is already fully formed, the seeds will be dehydrated. They weigh less. They look awful. They look like they're not going to do anything. But in fact, they grow at up to 5 times the rate of normal. They produce greater yield, and they do it without water or sunlight for long periods of time. Now, that does not happen in the man-made crop circles. You will not get these germination changes. Then you add to that the X-ray diffraction study, which occurred afterwards, and you find these alterations, this change in the crystalline structure of these are illite smectites, is the type of clay minerals. And those, that sort of change, as far as the geologists of the world currently know, occurs only in sedimentary rock with the pressure of, hundreds or just tons of mountains pressing down on sediments over hundreds or thousands of years. That's what it takes to do that. And yet we found it in surface soil in that Canadian crop circle. You put these things together and you very clearly you can demonstrate with enough money to do all the tests. It's very expensive and it's very time consuming. But when you've got enough money to do the tests, you can prove absolutely one way or the other whether a formation is genuine, meaning of the unknown source, Although we are pretty sure a plasma is involved, we don't know whether the plasma is being generated or directed by some unknown agent. And by that, I don't mean the military. I mean much more likely a consciousness of some sort to cause the actual crop circles themselves. But the fact is that mechanically flattened crop circles don't show any of these changes. And whenever we're given the opportunity to do the tests, we can show it. But very interestingly, many of these very elaborate large circles occur at the very end of the season when the farmer is already harvesting the field. We have never once been given the opportunity to properly sample both the plants and the soils in one of those and do all the work.
Nancy, I understand that crop circles can form in any vegetation, corn, wheat, spinach.
It appears,
even.
Yes.
Has there ever been any formation in a cannabis field?
I don't know. Never heard of it. There was an image of a cannabis plant in Germany last year, a crop circle that was made the image, but it wasn't in cannabis. And if there was one, I am not sure how we would find that out, because I would guess whoever owned that field would be covering it up as quick as they could.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, the reason I said this was because, I think it was either last year or the year before, there was a crop circle of an alien head, a typical grey head, but he had a pipe coming out of his mouth. And then this year, as you know, the one that
man-made.
Yeah.
But they're talking about this cannabis bong plant. This recent one has been it says in the lingo or the language that's deciphered that it says mothership.
What you have to be taking into consideration, I fought this, believe me, for 10, 15 years. I fought this idea. I am not into conspiracies. I don't like thinking that way. But when you see the attacks that BLT has suffered for 25 years now, the constant, the ignoring of any of the facts, none of our physical evidence has ever been challenged. None of it. No one has ever been able to explain any of these physical changes that we constantly tell people about. And in fact, now we've got people like Michio Kaku, of all people, the current Carl Sagan for the world, saying that the hoaxers are bringing magnetron. He said microwave ovens is what he said on television into the fields, The reason he said that is because he or whoever's behind him, because I can't believe he actually said that on his own, is they're trying to explain the apical node elongation and the expulsion cavities, both of which
I
are
think
caused
he
by
mentioned that, to be
heating.
honest with you, Nancy, was the reason I think he brought that up in context was because of the little fine balls that were found in the soil samples. And he was suggesting that
And
it was
those are caused by the
ultra-heat.
same thing. They're caused by what we believe and what we were able to prove in one case was the Perseid meteor shower dust, which was filtering down to Earth as it always does after a meteor shower, had been drawn into this rotating plasma by the magnetic fields given off by the plasma, heated up by the microwaves, which are also being emitted by the plasma, turning it into, liquid. The metal was turned, this is iron, was being turned into liquid. And then, if you think about it for a second, what happens to liquid metal when it drops through the air? It forms a ball.
That's right.
This is exactly how we made a shot for our cannons and stuff like that years ago. We would melt the metal, the lead, drop it off of a tower. It forms a ball as it falls. And in the crop circle case, they're tiny, they're microscopic, you can't see them. But when you find them and then do the analysis, you find that they have all the characteristics of meteoritic dust, which has been drawn in, clumped together, heated up, turned into a molten situation, and then dropped through the air as the plasma spirals down to actually hit the field.
Johnny Webb's got another question. Johnny, I just want to remind you we got about 8 minutes before our break, but go ahead.
Sure. I wanted to ask you, because obviously you go to these crop circles and you take samples and you stack them nicely, and then you bring them back to America, and then you give them to different sort of groups to go and investigate them.
No,
What
we
sort
do
of
all the work ourselves, except in the X-ray diffraction study.
Okay, but the point is that I'm asking is, when you're giving it to people back in America, what are they coming up with? What do they suggest is causing nodes?
We got an unnamed spiraling plasma system. Now, if you don't know anything about plasmas, one example of a very powerful plasma discharge that actually impacts the Earth's surface is lightning, of course. A much lesser energy plasma discharge that we're all familiar with is the Northern Lights. In recent years, blue jets, red sprites, elves are other forms of plasma discharges that have been discovered and documented now by science, and they get very close to the Earth's surface. What Levingood was proposing is that a still as yet unknown type of plasma discharge, one that has not yet been understood to exist by science, is what's actually causing the crop circles. Because whatever it is, it's got to actually reach the Earth's atmosphere. And it turns out that the impediment for a plasma actually reaching the surface of the Earth, and it has to be a fairly low energy plasma, because if it were high energy like lightning, it would burn the crops, and they're not burnt. It is in the early dawn hours, between 2 and 4 a.m., is the time when the electromagnetic shield around the Earth has diminished to the greatest degree, and that is the time when the bulk of the crop circles actually occur.
Now, one thing about the soil, they I don't recall her name, Phyllis something. She's
Phyllis Budinger.
Yes.
She's an analytical chemist and she's one of our professional consultants.
Exactly. Now, didn't she, when she was testing the soil, realize that it's aquaphobic, that essentially that water can't...
No, you're talking about the Delphos, Kansas UFO case.
Yes.
And in that case, yes, she found that the soils were what'd you call it, aquaphobic?
Aquaphobic, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
She did find that in the Delphos, Kansas case and in a few other UFO cases. She did not do the soil work for BLT. She does a lot of her work with BLT has been investigating other deposited substances related to UFOs, and related to the crop circle phenomenon and in particular, this very strange white powder that turns up fairly regularly in the Dutch crop circles and also inside Robert's home. She's done a great deal of that work. I mean, she does the FTIR work. Now, we have other scientists, one from the USGS who has been doing other X-ray diffraction work actually for us. There are a number of other tests that have been done on these substances. And what is interesting is when you compare what the results are of all of these tests done by different people with different expertise, they all come to the same answer. In Robert's case, what we're talking about is 99.99% pure hydromagnesite.
What really blows me away about these crop circles is that the way they're bent down is that their stem isn't actually broken, unlike, for instance, a man-made crop circle. Isn't that correct?
It depends on the crop. It depends on its age when it is flattened. Young crop, green crop, barley in particular, but oats, all of them, will bend very nicely when they are mechanically flattened, because unless the person doing it weighs 500 pounds, the plants will, reorient themselves. And this is a major misconception in the crop circle world. They think that a bent node is a sure sign of authenticity. It is not. A bent node, if you find it immediately after the circle has formed in young or old crop, it is then a very, very good sign. But there's a thing called phototropism and another thing called gravitropism. Mm-hmm. And these are the plant's natural tendency to reorient themselves to the sun. And the way they do that, particularly in young crop, is they bend at the nodes. And so if you go to a crop circle that's formed, let's say on June 1st, and you don't get there to the 4th or the 5th, and you see node bending like crazy throughout the thing, what you're seeing is phototropism. You're not seeing any indication that that circle was genuine.
Sorry, Nancy, to interrupt you there. We're just coming up to the end of the break, or near to the end of the break, but I just wanted to quickly ask you, when we see crop circles, they have these weaves and they're woven and they're underwoven and stuff like that. And my question to you is, are people that make crop circles, not the genuine ones like you explained, but people that make them, are they still able to create this same weave and woven, sort of underwoven in crop circles?
I don't know. In every case, I am certain that some of these more intricate patternings, if you will, in the lay, are in fact easily created by humans. Mechanical means by, just twisting them and moving them. But there's been no real study done on the lay details to absolutely rule out what humans could do and what they couldn't.
Now, with that being said, everybody stay tuned. We have so much more with Nancy Talbot when we return from this short break. Don't nobody go nowhere.
I'm Robert Vanderbroek, a Dutch medium from the Netherlands, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
This is Chris Bledsoe. You're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
This is David Sarita. You're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
Hi, I'm Dee Wallace, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live. I'm Linda Moulton Howe, and I'm listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
This is Dr. Sean David Morton, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
We are back to the second half of Dr. J Radio Live. Of course, we've been speaking to the one and only Miss Nancy Talbot on crop circles, a very important topic that not very many researchers devote their time to, which they should because of the implications, not to mention the physical proof and anomalies associated with them. But before we pick up this conversation, I wanted to turn it over to Nancy to talk about your website and where people can get a hold of you, where upcoming lectures, and so on and so forth. Nancy?
Thanks. I'm not quite finished with the Facebook problem. One of the reasons I wanted to do this interview so badly was that when Facebook did this closed down my site, my page, I don't have the email addresses of the thousands of people who were, my friends and following the page. And so I've been getting emails from some of them who have figured out how to contact me through BLT. It's bltresearch.com, and one of the first things you'll see on the homepage at the very top is report a crop circle contact. That's how you can reach me directly if you've got any questions. Now, some people have been using that, asking me why I blocked them, why I have unfriended them. Very upset that they think that I've done this. What they need to know is that I had nothing to do with this, and I tried everything to find out what I had done wrong, how I could get the Facebook page reestablished, and got only form letters back saying that they could do nothing to help me without ID. I sent them every ID I've got, kept getting the same form letter back until finally the last one of 4 simply said that my case had been closed and my account was disabled, period. So if you were one of my Facebook friends, in no way did I close you down or block you or anything like that. And there's one other thing that I'm now being told that I would like very much to hear from people if this is happening to them also. I had many private chats through Facebook with various people. Some of them are now telling me that when they went back to look at those chats, they have found that although their names and their questions will be there, where it should say my name, it simply says Facebook user, and my message, everything that I wrote back, has been completely deleted. And I have a number of examples of that now, and I'm wondering if other of my Facebook friends have found the same thing, and if they have, if they will let me know. Daniel Sheehan is looking at all this for me, and that could help provide evidence for a case that we might be able to make about this whole thing on Facebook. So the main way to reach me is through the BLT Research at the moment. It's just bltresearch.com. All of the information about the early plant and soil work is clearly listed under plant abnormalities, magnetic material in the soils. The clay mineral XRD study is there. We have another page called Other Facts, our published papers, a list of our professional consultants, and then I've also got a section on field reports, on lab reports, on eyewitness reports, and in particular the Vandenbroek case, which is Robert Vandenbroek is coming on tomorrow night.
Tomorrow, that's right.
And all the details of almost 20 years of my work with him. And perhaps the most interesting for those interested in the science, I'm sure Robert will be telling you about his recent videotape of this light ball and other events. But there's been a great deal of science done on his case also. And this white powder was how I first got involved in his case to begin with. I had been told by one of our field workers in the Netherlands that there was a young boy, he was 15 at the time, who had seen light balls creating a crop circle. And back then, I was only paying attention to the science, and I thought to myself, well, okay, maybe, but, I filed it away. I didn't pay much attention. The next year, the same field worker called back, telling me that a huge light ball had approached the balcony outside his bedroom. His house is in a very rural area of southern Holland. The balcony overlooks a small backyard and then a farm field immediately behind the house. And this light ball had appeared and was rotating in place, apparently as large as the windows, and these are floor-to-ceiling glass doors that open out onto a small balcony. And when it was gone, what was left on the floor was a pile of this white powder. And Robert's father was very interested in getting that material analyzed. That's why the field worker was calling me, was to see if we could do it. And so I said yes. They did send samples. We did do the analysis. In fact, Phyllis Budinger did the first analysis, and we got this information that it was hydromagnesite, which is not in itself unusual. What is unusual is the level of purity. The 99, it's laboratory grade. You and I could not go and buy this. You have to have a special pass with a laboratory in order to buy this material. And since then, the white powder has turned up every so often in some of the crop circles that occur in Holland. We've examined it repeatedly, many, many times. Mm-hmm. And then there was the incredible incident when it occurred in his home, in his house, his parents' home. He was still at his parents' home then, very securely locked. And an Indonesian moth was found. This is the middle of winter in 2010. It was January 2010. And here was this huge Atlas moth, indigenous to Southeast Asia and Indonesia in particular, lying on a table in his living room, covered again with the white powder. How anything could get into the house, much less this, I don't know. But on that same table, there were some cloth flowers in a vase, and mm-hmm. they were clearly singed. There were burn marks on the woodwork behind the flowers, and this white powder is scattered all over the place. And in that case, we did every single examination you can do to prove what it was, including the XRD, which Dr. Eberl did, and the FTIR, and isotopic analysis, and every other test that you can do, all of which, again, came up with this 99.99% pure hydromagnesite laboratory grade. Now, one of the things that hydromagnesite is used for, that people use it for, in a much less pure, nowhere near as pure as this, but we use it as a fire retardant in our fire extinguishers. And so one of the questions we then came up with was, because we had this very delicate moth, and we had burning, on the cloth roses, and we had the burn marks, on the woodwork behind the roses, is it possible that this particularly pure hydromagnesite was there in order to keep the house from burning down? I mean, we don't know, but it's the only thing we can come up with at this point, because the other uses for hydromagnesite don't seem to be applicable here. It seems that it must have been there somehow in the middle of winter. An insect which lives only in Southeast Asia is suddenly lying inside his family's home covered in this powder. And the next night, another insect, Robert's friend Roy, had come over to photograph all this, and Robert saw a light ball approaching Roy's car outside and apparently impacted the windshield. And when they went to look to see what was there, it was another Indonesian insect. Again, we're talking freezing cold Dutch weather, and this was a butterfly, a two-tailed jay, lying on the windshield of Roy's car. Those insects never live in Holland, and how they got there, I mean, you can only imagine. But very interestingly, the next year in winter for the northern hemisphere, the first 2 crop circles ever to be reported in Indonesia then occurred.
Interesting. And the fact that you have these moths, and I've been to Holland once in June and once in May, and even then, I must say it was rather cold for someone living in Los Angeles. But before we pick up that, and of course, another question from across the pond, for the listeners out there, for those who lost everything you've put up on Facebook, can you give your email address directly or anything?
I can't
else?
do it because of the disinformation, the hoaxing. They absolutely will bury they do this anyhow. I'm having problems anyhow. And it's easy enough for people to go to the website and simply fill in the report a crop circle form. All you have to do is give me your name, your phone number, and an email address, and then I can get back to you. But if I make it public, I am inundated with the people who are trying to stop this information, all of this information, from getting out.
And remember, everybody, her website link is right on our webpage, drjradiolive.com, as well as it will be in the archives once it hits YouTube after this show makes its rounds. Let's go across the Atlantic pond. Johnny Webb, what do you got?
Well, Andrew in Leeds in the UK on Facebook, he's asking, is there a connection to ley lines with crop circles and ball lightning?
I can't answer that. I haven't studied it. There are people who believe that the crop circles, there is a relationship between the placement of crop circles, the genuine ones, and ley lines. Ley lines are not generally recognized by the scientific community as being real or meaningful. That doesn't mean they're not, but I have no background that would help me with that, and so I don't really know.
I'd like to shift gears a little bit now, because obviously we've dealt with crop circles. We understand you've got years of experience with it, but then you've had some recent experience with a Dutch gentleman called Robert.
I've been working with Robert since 1997.
Now, I've seen a few of your videos, and for some of our listeners that haven't, there'll be links for it afterwards. But there's a time where you went to stay with Robert in Holland, and you experienced sensation things for your own self. Can you tell us about that, please?
Well, I've seen 2 crop circles form while in his company. In fact, I think the first one startled him as much as it did me. It was in 2001. I would spend as much time as I could every summer in Holland with him, witnessing firsthand. Nothing that is on the BLT website about Robert is something, I've witnessed every single thing that's on there myself, and the majority of the photos that are actually posted on the BLT site, the anomalous photos, the creatures, the other sorts of life forms, the people who are deceased, all of that, were taken by Robert with my camera and me standing right next to him. The UFO photos, all of it. So I know those are genuine. And when we go into the fields, we normally would take only my camera. He didn't even take his own usually. Neither of us had laptops. Neither of us had any other electronic gizmos. And Robert, I keep my camera in a case where he can't touch it. And he would simply wait until he felt an energy present. In the early days, he almost always described it simply as an energy. And then he would ask if he could have my camera. And I would have put in every day. I put in a brand new chip and new batteries. And it was labeled in my handwriting, the date and everything. I'd hand him the camera, and then I'd stand right with him, right next to him. A lot of times I had my head right next to his, watching as he took the images. And I saw them as they occurred. And then when we would scroll back, he usually takes 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe 9 or 10 at a time. And then we would stop and scroll back to see what was there. And there it is, right there in the field. I mean, if there was no computer involved, I don't know how to emphasize that strongly enough. When this first started happening with Robert, and I was visiting him every year, and I was staying in his room. They gave me his room, which was the good one, at the back of the house. He didn't have a computer. He not only did he not have one, he had never touched one, and it didn't have the faintest idea what Googling was, because the debunkers were saying he Googled everything, you know, and then somehow or other put it all on my camera. Well, he didn't even have a computer. You know, it's absurd. When he feels the energies and takes the photos, whatever it is that is coming through, and it's quite a variety of stuff that comes through, simply appears on the camera. I watched one summer, 2007, my brother had died, and I wasn't even sure I was going to go to Holland, but I did. And Robert had told me that he thought my brother was going to appear on the camera before I got there. And I told him I didn't want it. I wasn't ready and didn't want it. But when I arrived, he again told me right away that he thought my brother was going to come on the camera. And I think he knew that my brother was going to come, and he was trying to prepare me, I guess. But the very first day, we went into one of the fields where there were lots of crop circles still there. There had been a lot of them in that field that year. And it was in the afternoon, daylight. And it was the first time he had touched my camera that year. And he told me as we got into the field, your brother is here. Can I use your camera? And so I took it out and I handed it to him. And I stood right there as he took 60-some images of my brother's face, whom he had never met. He didn't even know his name. My brother's last name is not the same as mine. Talbot is my married name. And yet there was my brother, as clear as a bell. He wouldn't have known it so well as I, but I could tell immediately. So that, in combination with actually seeing crop circles form, in 2001, there were these brilliant tubes of light that he and I had been out in the fields doing geomagnetometer work for Dr. William Roll that year, actually. And we'd gotten nothing. I mean, hauling this equipment all over the place. And I was going to the crop circle sites to see if we could find any anomalies, geomagnetic anomalies in these locations. And we'd been doing it for weeks, and it was hot, and I was tired and quite cross. And that particular night was near the end of my stay, and Robert wanted to go back out into the circles to take pictures, because by then he was getting light bulb pictures and all kinds of things. And I was so annoyed, I said, no, I am sick and tired of this phenomenon. It's too hard to study. Why can't it be more direct? I'm going to bed. And I marched myself up to the bedroom, which is at the back of the house, these floor-to-ceiling glass doors. They were wide open because it was so hot. I got into bed and was going to read for a little bit. Robert was downstairs in the kitchen, and its windows faced in the same direction as the bedroom windows. And I heard first the cattle at the end of the lane begin to bellow. I know from having talked to hundreds of farm owners and landowners on whose properties crop circles have formed, that if they have animals, the animals will begin to give distress calls when a crop circle is forming. And so I thought, well, gee, I ought to get up and go stand on the balcony and I'll get to see this all happen. But something warned me not to. And so I went back to reading, and a few minutes later, the cattle started to bawl so loudly, I knew that something was getting ready to happen. So I started to swing my legs out of the bed, and before I could do it, a straight tube, I'm not talking like a jagged thing of lightning, I'm talking a perfectly cylindrical, perhaps 2 foot wide, tube of light came crashing down into that field directly behind the house, as close as it could get to his backyard. Scared the dickens out of me. It lit the field up like daylight. It lit my room up like I was on Broadway or something, and I wasn't even sure whether it was coming into the room. Then it went out. There was no noise. There was no smell. There was nothing. I thought, gee, did I really see that? And before I could move, another tube of light, whoomp, comes down into that field with energy that I couldn't begin to explain to you. And then a third one, and by this time, Robert had he saw the first two down on the first floor in the kitchen. So he was yelling for me, hoping that I was seeing the same thing. He came dashing up the steps, so he didn't see the third tube. But there was a third tube of light that came down in exactly the same place, And I had, of course, seen it. We then went running downstairs to the windows, the doors, to look up to see where this was coming from. And there was absolutely nothing up there. I mean, if it was invisible because it looked like a perfectly normal night sky. Robert we both wanted to go out, but we were a little nervous because the power, the force in those tubes, it scared me. But he's a little braver. And so after a few seconds, he stepped down, and he didn't get zapped. So I thought, okay, I grabbed a flashlight, and we went to the fence, 85, 90 feet at the back of his backyard, and I shone the light over into the field. It was string beans that year. And there, not more than 10 feet into that field, and directly in line with my bed, I might add, was a brand new crop circle with what I think it was a mist rising off because the crop gets a dew on it at night. And the heat involved had turned that to a mist, and I could see that rising from this brand new crop circle. And I'm telling you, it was in the closest growing crop to my bed as it could possibly have been, right after I had said, why can't this phenomenon be more direct?
And it was. We have quite a few questions. First, let's go to Dan Hoquist, who's been monitoring our chat room. Then we'll go to Johnny. Dan?
Hi, Nancy. This comes from Lisa Ball, who is texting from Flagstaff, Arizona. She says she has seen a video on crop circles that showed metal discs that were dug up in their centers. And she asks if you know about these and where they were.
They were in Germany, in Grassdorf, in the early 2000s. I don't know the truthfulness of that story. I did see one of the plates because I happened to be in England when Hesseman, Hermann Hesseman, the guy who was reporting all this, he was also in Germany, and he had brought, if I remember correctly, it was the bronze plate. The gold one has never been seen by anybody. Apparently only the silver and the bronze ones still exist. He claims they were found underneath that particular crop circle, dug down underneath, and that the symbols on them replicated the actual design of the crop circle. I wasn't directly involved in the analysis. I have never seen a professional analysis of the plates. So again, it's one of those things I can't. The event was definitely reported. That's what he claims, and I don't know one way or the other whether what he's saying, what he said back then, is true, because there was never any professional analysis of any kind done, either on the crop circle itself or on the plates, to the best of my knowledge.
Like I said, we have a few more questions. Before I get to mine, let's go across the Atlantic pond. Johnny?
Hi, Nancy. It's John again. Yeah, I'd like to go back to, obviously, your experience. This is a nighttime experience for you, where this beam of light has come down, and I believe you described it as pressurizing. Yeah, but you described it as they're putting pressure on the ground on top of these string beans. And so the next day in the daylight, you going out there, you're witnessing this crop circle that you believe, and Robert, has been made by this sort of like downforce of light. Now, for you, you're going to be saying in your mind, well, this is a real crop circle. What did you find that was different from a real crop circle than a man-made? Because looking at the photos of the crop circle, it doesn't look like a perfectly made, pristine crop circle. It looks like a rough crop circle, but you in your heart know it's real. So what was different about it for you?
I didn't understand what you saw in the pictures that you don't like, but what we saw...
What I don't like.
I'm sorry?
It's not that I don't like it. It's just my observation of the crop circle. But like I say, what now you know it's a real deal. What was your observation?
What I saw the next day, remember this was in string beans, first of all, the only one I know of actually ever in string beans. And the work that BLT has done is primarily on cereal crops, talking about oats, barley, wheat, rye, things of that sort. We'd never worked on one in string beans, so all I could look at was the fact that the plants were laid in one smooth, it wasn't a circle, it was an ellipse with a long crossbar, or a long pathway going off the north end, and then a crossbar, like it was literally the capital T was what went off one end of it. And the crops were laid in one big swoop right around this oval, very flat. The beans were ready to be harvested. In fact, I ate some. I took a bunch of them and had them for dinner that night. Robert wouldn't touch them. I think he thought it might light him up or something. But the plants were laid in this beautiful circular rotation, and then the pathway was laid, I think it was 2 rows of beans wide, straight. They were just simply flattened, not damaged, not broken, just flattened, and so was the crossbar. But it doesn't have, those plants don't have the same nodes that we examine in the cereal crop, and so there was no way to equate any changes in the string bean plants. There were none visible, other than the fact that the plants were flattened fairly nicely to the ground, and the beans were completely unharmed, as were all of the leaves. There was no burning of any sort.
Now, let me ask you about the meaning of crop circles. David Sarita.
I can't tell you the meaning, and Robert will be better at telling you his ideas about that. It is my belief, based on largely the work with Robert for these last almost 20 years, that the purpose of, we're talking about, why crop circles would occur, that the purpose is, I think, now, it's an effort on the part of a consciousness that is enlightened, and I'm hoping spiritually enlightened, to simply get people who are inclined, who are interested in these things, to pay attention and to think more profoundly about the spiritual nature of reality. I'm not talking religion here. I'm talking about simply the spiritual foundation behind all existence and all consciousness. That is what I've come to think is the purpose, the major purpose. Now, this does not mean that some crop circles, genuine crop circles, they might encode mathematically or geometrically, for instance, certain ideas which would appeal, would attract the interest of people who are well educated in geometry. That seems to make sense to me. Others might be in a formation of a particular artistic design that would appeal to people interested in art. I think the variety of shapes and designs of the genuine ones, and there is quite a variety, is simply to attract the attention of different kinds of people with different interests in their regular lives, to make them stop and look and think, oh my goodness, this is fascinating, this is interesting, what does this mean? Because when people start to ask those questions, they tend to go toward the idea of this larger consciousness, this larger reality. Does that help you?
So it's like, yeah, so what you're saying is people that, say, see the visualization of a crop circle are then able to sort of, in their mind, create new neurons pathways, in a sense, and create a better understanding. And this is some way helping people to a higher consciousness.
That's what I think. I mean, and it's all positive. Every single experience that I know of, all of my personal experiences, I have experienced presences when I've been in crop circles. I have experienced what I call a UFO energy. One time, and I can't remember. It's so amazing. Robert and I had gone to a special field, and we got out of the car in the middle of the day, and I don't know why I said this, but I said to Robert, it feels like UFO energy. And I'm not particularly into UFOs, but I said that, have no idea why. He gets out of his side of the car and he says, well, yes, it does. Can I use your camera? I walked maybe 10 feet in front of him, was facing him directly. He's using my camera again, which I've just taken out of my locked case. I handed it to him. He takes one shot, and there's a UFO right over my head. Now, what does that mean?
That blows me away, actually.
it
Was there
kind of
any
blew me
sound or
away.
anything with that UFO, Nancy? When you were there with that UFO in your presence, did you hear any sounds or smells or anything?
No, as in my case, when I was a child, I did have an encounter in daytime, very close, up personal. I can't remember how they label it, but there was, when I was a kid, I was babysitting a bunch of other children, and one of these, the typical Billy Meyer kind of UFO, suddenly it was there. And it froze us, so we couldn't move, and we couldn't talk. All of the kids were frozen in this state. And I'd never heard of UFOs back then. I thought it was alive. It never occurred to me that it was a craft. I thought it was like an elephant or some weird creature. It felt alive. And then I was aware that it had an agenda. It was doing something. And that didn't bother me too much. But what bothered me was, in that case, I was absolutely aware that its agenda there was no empathy in this thing, whatever it was. And if its agenda that day had been, go find a bunch of kids in a field somewhere, pick them up in the air 1,000 feet, drop them, and then write down what happens, it would have done it without it didn't mean to harm, but neither did it mean not to harm. And so that scared the dickens out of me. Now, you get to the UFO phenomenon, for me, many, many, many years later, and the experiences I've had, the crop circle phenomenon, and I have had the opposite kind of interactions. Nothing fearful, nothing aggressive, nothing that has not been respectful. In many cases with Robert, events have been so incredible sometimes that I have had to say out loud, enough, no more, I can't handle any more right now, that's enough. And it stops. Whatever the incredible thing that's going on right that minute, the light phenomenon I'm witnessing, whatever I'm feeling the presence of, if it gets too much for me, it has always stopped. In other words, the impression I'm left with is that the energies that are involved with crop circles are the opposite of whatever that thing was that I encountered when I was a kid, and they are, in fact, completely respectful of leading me and you and anyone else at whatever pace we can go. The idea is not to scare us. It's not to frighten us. It's not to intimidate. It's to very gently nudge us toward opening our minds and our hearts to a larger reality. And it's patient. It's willing to wait while you catch up. And believe me, with some of these events, if they happen to you, I can guarantee you it would take you a while. I used to come back from Holland every year and just sit here doing nothing for a month or two, trying to simply absorb what I had just witnessed. It takes a while to incorporate it,
Yeah, I would think so, especially having this object above your head responding to you. That's the part that's most amazing. As you said, when you say you have had enough, it stops. It respects you.
It has, and because of that, I don't have the fear that people, when I tell them some of the events that have happened, they think, well, boy, weren't you scared to death? And I would have been if I hadn't already had constant, repeated examples with Robert, with crazy things, utterly off-the-wall things happening. And then when I really can't handle any more that day, it's all I can handle right then, it stops. And it seems to know, and Robert will probably tell you this, whatever it is, it seems to know you or whoever it's paying attention to at the moment better than you know yourself. It knows when, okay, back off. And because of that, I've been able to tolerate many more extreme things. Robert's going to tell you tomorrow about an event that happened this spring where he manifested in a country he has never been in.
That's
in
right,
his whole life.
Spain, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
And I would not have been able to have absorbed the truth of that had I not known all the other things, if I hadn't had all these other experiences over almost 20 years now. It took me, I'm a little slow, maybe it took me longer than some people, but when you're suddenly confronted with things you've absolutely never seen before and have no reference points for, no framework. You have to. It takes me a while. I have to process it before I'm ready for the next step in my growth.
One of the experiences, Nancy, that you had with Robert Vanderbroek was that you said that he took your camera and he took photographs in it, and what appeared was your deceased brother.
Correct.
And knowing that Robert is a medium as well, did your brother tell you a message from Robert?
Well, you're not going to believe this. Maybe you will. I didn't. Okay, I'll just tell you. The first day, the first afternoon, there were 50-some shots that Robert took, always of Bill, over and over and over again. But his ear was sticking out funny. His ear didn't stick out like that in life. And I noticed it, but I didn't really put two and two together. But I had wanted, he'd only been dead 2 months, and I had wanted to, he loved the ocean, and I'd wanted to get the Beach Boys, were his favorite album, and go down to the ocean somewhere and play it for him just privately someday. And I hadn't done this by the time I got to Holland. I just hadn't had the time to do it. So after those first images, I drove the next day into the little nearby town, and I bought a Beach Boys album. And next day, Robert and I went back to the same field, because I was figuring, well, if he can be here, he can hear me. And so we took the car, same thing in the late afternoon, backed it in. I put the car as far into the field as I could, put the Beach Boys album on, and cranked it. I wanted my brother to hear it. Robert again said, he's here, can I use your camera? And he then took another, I think it was 12 shots that second day. In every single one of those, my brother's ear is back to normal. Now, wow. I don't know. It took me more than a year of thinking about that. And I think what I've come away from it with is my brother was a very assertive personality. He was always a go-getter on the go, you know. And the feeling I got was that ear sticking out in the first batch was his way, maybe all he could do in the other state, to say to me, Nancy, for the heaven's sakes, go get the damn album, play it for me, because I got things to do. And when I came back and did that, the ear went back to normal, and he's never appeared again. The feeling I eventually came to was that he was waiting for me to do this because he knew, that being dead doesn't mean you don't know things, and he knew that I wanted to do this, and once I'd done it, he could then get on with whatever the next thing was he had to do.
It reminded me, when I heard that story, of a movie called Back to the Future. I don't know if it was 1 or 2. I think it was probably 2 or 3. But in that movie, there was a scene where the main guy was looking at a photograph and his family was sort of disappearing around him. And he had to sort of go through a scenario to bring them back. And when I heard that story about your brother, Nancy, that's what sort of came to mind. He's showing you something from the other side, but there's something that you have to do this side in order to get that image to look correct again. And in this case, it's playing, the Beach Buddies.
It seems, it sounds outrageous, I know, but it happened. And that's my interpretation of it, because I don't know what else to do with it. It's what feels like what happened.
Do you feel now, rather than taking a scientific approach on things, that you mentioned earlier that we need to take a more spiritual approach and a more sort of loving approach? Do you want to tell us a bit more about that? We're coming up to about sort of 5 minutes, so really this is your last chance, I think, to tell us what you really want to tell us that you feel from the whole of your experiences.
Well, I think that the scientific approach to anomalous phenomena is important, because there are many people, as you know, who cannot, science is their current God. If they are given, and this was mostly because of my mother, my own family, and their education, they could not possibly accept the reality of any of this sort of thing without science. I did not want huge numbers of people, and there are many people in the world, who cannot even begin to approach the possibility that these events are real unless there is some sort of scientific thing that helps them accept it. That was the reason why I decided to do the science. I knew it was a way that could make it possible to not leave out that whole section of humanity from this incredible thing that was happening. And I knew the first time I ever saw a crop circle that, in fact, my very first impression was that this was a calling card from the larger cosmic source, the source energy. That was what I thought the first time I ever saw one. But I knew that the science had to be done because I knew people like my mother and lots of very educated people would not begin to pay attention to the circle phenomenon and many other things without it. But through the last, 19 years of working with Robert and all that I have learned with him and observing what goes on and experiencing firsthand so much of this, it's now come down to the most logical, reasonable, sensible thing that I can understand about the entire phenomenon is what he says, which is that there is this larger cosmic source energy. Some people call it God, some people call it, the huge variety of names, whatever people call it. But that there is this cosmic consciousness. We are all bits and pieces of it, as is everything else. And that the world, the people of the world, we've lost touch with how critical this aspect of life, of our life here on Earth, is. It's a critical aspect that so many people now, nowadays it's all, and we have, it's do you have a lot of money? Are you famous? Are you beautiful? Leaving out completely the idea that what's behind everything, ourselves, nature, everything that we observe, the entire cosmos, is some sort of spiritually, vastly enlightened consciousness.
Well
and that's
said.
what I've come to believe.
And I'm glad you wrapped it up in the full circle, because that is what we essentially started with. And that is a major theme in a lot of what our guests have been saying in the last few years. And it's almost as if they've really picked up on this consciousness that we're all connected and that there's something greater, rather than looking at UFOs in the sky and trying to determine if they're real, or crop circles. They are now looking at the bigger picture and the meaning that we have the connection to them. So, Nancy,
I think the science has helped some of them, I hope.
Yes, I agreed. It's been an absolutely terrific time. And I wanted to ask you if you have any final thoughts that you want to say to our audience, believers or skeptics alike. And mind you, this is an international show where we've had questions, calls, and comments from 42 countries and counting. So what would you have to say to them all?
That we progress based on my own case. It appears to me that we progress in our understanding and our potential, our capability of grasping some of this, each at our own pace. There's no point in trying to push or in any way force this. It's offered by the universe on many different levels, the crop circles just being one, and that you have to have patience and a lot of tolerance for the rate at which other people are progressing and growing.
And fortunately,
and I hope people
they
will
are.
go to the BLT website and write to me their thoughts and ideas. I very much appreciate the feedback. Now that I don't have Facebook, I would love to hear what other people think about all of this and anything else they'd like to write about.
And again, everybody who's listening to this or watching this now at bltresearch.com, right under Nancy's photo, and you'll also see it on our website, drjradiolive.com. Remember, that is the only name you need to remember, the name of the show, Dr. J Radio Live. That is DRJ Radio Live. The same name as where we archive our shows on YouTube. Of course, also Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Flickr, Tumblr, YouTube, Google+, Gmail, Pinterest, Slack, Snapchat, things that I don't even know. Everything is just the same name. With that being said, first, of course, I want to thank my guest, of course, Nancy Talbot, for staying up so late to do this show. We will definitely have her back, especially after we speak to Robert tomorrow. That'll be a fantastic show. And I want to, of course, remind you all to don't remember to check out the shows on the archives afterwards with a lot of the amazing footage that we've gotten from our guests and the 500 plus videos we received from the world famous researcher from Mexico and of course television personality anchorman Jaime Maussan. And of course I do want to thank my team, starting from all the way to the east. We got Johnny Webb in London, then we have Tom Schaefer in Miami. Tom is better known. And then we got SoCal Dan in of course south of me, and we also have Fausto Perez right here in Los Angeles, and as am I in the City of Angels, or Not So Angelic City. With that being said, this is Dr. J, and we are officially signing off.